Hello. Good day, everyone. We're so excited to see you here. Over 100 people I'm seeing today in the webinar. So welcome and thank you so much for attending today. We have a fantastic session for you, all about modernizing your web with Jamstack and with Netlify. So we're going to welcome Bhavana and Chris in a minute here. Just a couple of quick administration things for you. You've got the chat window over here. Please feel free to use it. Please keep it clean today and respect your fellow participants. There's also a Q&A, and you can put questions for the speakers inside that Q&A, and Bhavana and Chris will answer those at the end of their presentation. So please do put your questions in during the session. It's a good place to keep your notes about questions you have during the session. And really quickly, yes, we're recording today, so we'll be sending out the on-demand link for you to watch again or to share with your colleagues. So that will come out in an email with some additional resources that I'm going to share with you toward the end. So stick around and hear about some exciting resources that we have coming up on this topic following the presentation. So with that, I'd love to welcome Bhavana and Chris to the stage, and we're just so excited to share this topic with you. Bhavana and Chris.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Bhavana Srinivas, a Senior Solutions Engineer at Netlify. I've been here for more than 3 years now, and I primarily work with our enterprise customers to, help them build the best web experiences on Netlify. Joining from Toronto, Canada, and I have Chris Hannaby as well with me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris. I'm a senior solutions engineer here as well. I've been here a little less time than Bhavna, but learning lots from her all the time. And similarly, I work with our enterprise customers, help them adopt these, modern front end tools and architectures. Looking forward to sharing some information about that with you all today.
Yeah. So between, the two of us and the rest of the team, we worked with multiple different organizations to make the dream of Jamstack come alive for them. And today we want to share that with you. So we're going to be walking through why teams are considering the Jamstack, what they can build with it, and how to scale these applications all the way to production. So we'd love to hear from you what brought you to this webinar. So whether you're trying to understand this architecture or curious what it would actually mean to adopt it for your organization. So please let us know in the chat and we can discuss more about this towards the end of the webinar.
So we talked to a really wide variety of teams that are building all kinds of stuff for the web. And we see them kind of all asking this same question, which is, how do we really deliver the very best web experiences to our end customers? And as I said, it's all kinds of different things. So it might be, a customer like Loblaws, who's one of Canada's largest grocery stores and building out large e-commerce sites, or people like Peloton, who are building out a range of things, e-commerce, traditional marketing sites, really dynamic things like the applications that are used within the bikes and the treadmills. And as I said, all of these teams are trying to figure out how do they do that in the best way. And we're seeing that a lot of teams are shifting from a traditional kind of monolithic way of building a website to this Jamstack architecture. And there's really a number of key reasons. For the development team, they just want to be able to ship things to market much faster. They want to be able to operate as a front-end team without having to coordinate with lots of back-end and DevOps team. And they want to be able to choose exactly the tech stack that works best for whatever property they're building, and that be able to take advantage of modern frameworks like React and Vue, or things like GraphQL to fetch data. And for the end users, they really want to be able to deliver something that's very performant, has great user experience, that's reliable, that stays up and is available. And yeah, the way that teams are doing this is with this Jamstack architecture. And just to kind of clarify a couple of terms quickly, when we talk about a monolith or kind of legacy approach, we're looking at this sort of thing on the left here, which is like a traditional web server architecture where we have some sort of full stack framework. Maybe it's something in PHP, or it could be something like WordPress or Drupal that is handling kind of every single request from a user, rendering those pages for every single request, talking to a database to fetch data. And this kind of really limits the freedom that the front-end team has to develop their own experience. When we talk about a decoupled approach or a Jamstack approach, we're looking at something like the picture on the right, where we fetch data ahead of time as part of a build process using some sort of site generator. We'll talk about some of those options later. And those things are kind of we're pre-rendering as much as possible into static pages that can be served from an edge network to users. And we may, use a lot of different third-party services that we fetch data from, maybe at client side, to kind of create more dynamic and rich experiences. But by kind of pre-rendering all of that stuff in advance, we get a much more scalable architecture that's really easy to kind of deliver performant web experiences to loads of customers all around the globe.
Now is, what does it take to move to this decoupled web? Because the shift is pretty big in some ways, where for some teams it's a whole culture shift. Like, you're changing how you're deploying your sites, and it also sometimes involves a very different tech stack, and it enables different ways of working and making updates to the sites. So the decisions that you make early on will have really massive impact on your team's productivity or the final outcome of the site itself. So you want to be pretty deliberate about making these decisions early on. And that's exactly what Chris and I do. We're working with teams, we understand what the current state of their web properties are, the tech stack being used, and also the pain points that they want to solve for in an ideal world. And then using this, we come up with a migration strategy that suits the team skill sets, their timelines, and their objectives. So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's dive into the process.
So as Bhavana said, the very first thing to do is kind of take stock of where we are now. So let's understand, what do we have, what is our existing architecture, and where are we trying to go? What's the new thing we want to build? And as we're kind of thinking about that, some of the core things we want to look at is basically kind of how is our current site built? Are we building out a traditional monolithic thing at the moment? Are we working in a framework like WordPress or PHP? And if so, you kind of need to think about what's going to happen to some of those existing backend services when you migrate to a decoupled architecture where you're building out the front end separately. If you're using something that's kind of like a monolithic CMS like WordPress or Drupal, you might choose to build out that decoupled front end, but maybe you continue to use the existing CMS. If the content editor is already happy with that, you may be able to switch to use that in a headless mode. If you're doing something like an e-commerce thing in a monolithic way, you might choose to break out some of those backend services into individual separate services like payments and storefront and fulfillment. And maybe those are things that are managed internally by your team as microservices, or maybe you'll start to replace some of those components with third-party solutions from providers like Shopify or Stripe or BigCommerce.
Yeah. And I think like sometimes it's even more basic than that, right? Like some teams have not yet adopted a Git-based workflow, or they don't even have CI/CD workflows in place. And so even those are good things to consider. Like, is that a way of working that you want to enable for your teams? And even in terms of your application and production with the monolith kind of application, we've seen where a site is served from a single region, right? And it becomes a single point of failure. If that region goes down, then your site's not available for your users. So considering whether that's how you're serving it or whether you're using a CDN and which parts of it do you want to take with you to that next stack is important. So for instance, like, we work with Spring, which did like a thorough evaluation of their platforms and goals as they moved from a monolithic stack all the way to the Jamstack. And what the Spring is, for those of you who are not aware, is it's a platform where anyone can create a custom e-commerce storefront. And they have over 7 million creators who use their services. And especially during COVID, a lot of these people went on to moving away from the traditional brick and mortar kind of service to selling their goods online. So they, Spring saw a huge uptake of users. And so they needed a web platform that's flexible. It supports this kind of rapid scale to keep up with the number of folks going online. And so they shifted from a monolith that uses Ruby on Rails to a decoupled architecture that uses microservices. So the first thing, like Chris was saying, was take stock of what all their backend does and decouple parts of that. So storefronts, payments, fulfillment, checkout all became different backend microservices. And then they built the front end on Netlify. So what was traditionally a Ruby on Rails app became a Next.js application. And this allowed them to pre-generate most of the site and ssr some of the other content based on user interaction, so that gave their users also a really good experience as well while browsing the site. And what they gained in this process of this migration is that their build time went from 90 minutes all the way down to 1 minute. Their sites have much more improved conversion rates when they deployed it to Netlify. And they currently build over 7 million storefronts on Netlify, which would have taken just much longer to scale on their monolith because they're maintaining not only the infrastructure, but also the application and running that in production. So this is just one example. Let's continue seeing like what other teams had to consider as they made the shift to the Jamstack.
So we talked a little bit about the technology pieces we want to think about. Another really important thing about any of these sort of migrations is who are the people that are involved? What are the teams that currently are working with the site? What are the workflows that they're using right now? So it may be really important to kind of consider the content editor workflow and how they go through their different approval steps, how they're able to push things into production. How does that work now? How do you want it to work in the future? What are the DevOps team doing right now to maintain the site, and what is the kind of ideal future state? What sort of involvement will they have? A lot of teams kind of want to move DevOps to work on more critical things, right? They don't want to spend all their time focusing on front-end infrastructure because they have more kind of pressing domain-specific problems that they need to deal with within their organization.
Yeah. I think when we start talking to teams is when we realize that, a website, it takes like a huge team to manage a web property, be it a marketing site or an application. And sometimes there's just way too much dependence between these different teams, which they want to let go of, right? Like the front end should be able to push changes without having to call somebody from DevOps to spin up an environment and make sure that the changes are live and the cache is invalidated. So it's really crucial to know what are the workflows that you care about, that you need, and what are the workflows that you're willing to give up in this new stack. Because again, like the migration, I feel is always like a clean slate. You get a chance to work on things that you want to, which are aspirational. And so might as well think about all that as you make that change. So this flows really well into what I want to cover next, which is like the pain point and what's not working with your current site. And the challenge that we see most teams are facing when they're building a monolithic application is, first of all, to be able to continue to produce a very competitive web experience, right? Like keeping up with your customer changes, keeping up with your market conditions. Like dev teams are like constantly fighting against that older tech stack. And because the organization is often built around the tech stack, there's just like a huge coordination tax to get anything done. So this means that, aligning with everyone, involving and managing all these dependencies between teams just to push like a blog out. And then finally, there's also the struggle to keep the app reliable and performant. Like developing it and building it is one thing, but then managing your production traffic, security events, traffic spikes is a whole other ball game. So again, it becomes a chance to address these pain points with the new architecture, new tech stack, new workflows. And that's exactly what Twilio did with their console application on Netlify.
Yeah, so Twilio is a great example of this kind of migration. They have their console application, which is incredibly complex. It brings together kind of 30 different Twilio products all into a single interface, and it's managed by a team of something like 300 engineers. And they were using a micro front-end architecture with their kind of legacy application, but all of that needed to be handled by kind of a traditional server that was server-side rendering things. And that was a server that was kind of based in the US. But Twilio has a huge global audience, and so for people who weren't located close to the US, there was a really poor user experience. They get very long response times when they're kind of trying to navigate between different sections of the site. And the team was just struggling as well with the coordination required in deploying changes to this large application. Um, and so the Twilio team migrated to a Jamstack architecture for kind of the core shell of the application. And this kind of immediately improved the experience for all their users around the globe. So they went from something like 2 seconds to time to first byte in the Asia region to something like 30 milliseconds, which is a 30 times improvement. And they were able to do this in a kind of incremental way because they have this micro front end structure. So some of the applications that were already using more modern technology like React were able to move straight to the Netlify platform and be served in this Jamstack way. But for some more legacy applications that made up this micro front end, they could be injected in an iframe if they were using something like PHP that was going to take a bit longer to migrate. And the Twilio team really saw a huge, as we already mentioned, there's a huge benefit in terms of the user experience, but also just the developer experience. The teams went from shipping something like maybe once a week or twice a week to shipping 10, 15 times a day, which really just increased the velocity that they were able to deliver new features to users.
I think we just released a full-blown case study. So that's on our website, and we can follow up with that in the email. So that one in general, is a great win for like the decoupled web. And so we're going to be sharing more of this with you all as we go on. So at this point, in this migration journey, you hopefully have full knowledge of, the current state of your web apps and a sense of how decoupling can actually benefit your organization. So now let's move on to what are the tools that you have to consider for actually making the shift. And when it comes to tooling, there's just so many choices. And so one big criteria that can help narrow it down is the kind of application that you're actually building. So is it mostly content, right? Like, for instance, it could be a marketing site or a doc site or landing pages, which has fairly static content, which changes pretty infrequently. And so the tools you choose for those kind of sites will be very different from, say, a web app, for instance, like even app.netlify.com, which has a login, it has a database, it has user management. And so what you consider for this kind of a web app will be totally different, right? Like maybe you're using a lot of third-party services or you're using your own backend. So making stock of that becomes important. And then there's a whole other category of like, really large sites. It could be like, for instance, Citrix has their doc site on Netlify. They have more than 100 different products. And one strategy we've seen work there is taking a large site and then breaking it up into smaller logical sections. So now with Citrix, instead of building one giant site, which has 125 products and several subpages inside that, they're now building 125 different sites, one for each product. And that just makes it easy for those individual product teams to manage the content on their section. It also helps them maintain the build times, right? Like, so if I'm making a change in product A, only product A has to rebuild, not the entire site. So you're able to push changes also much faster. So this whole micro front-end architecture is one that we see commonly on Netlify being employed by large international sites, which have several domains, like what we see with Unilever or like with Citrix in the doc site, like I just mentioned. There's a whole other blog on this that I've written, so we can share that with you as well, or you can find it within our blog section.
So another big thing to consider is kind of what does the new team look like that's going to be building out this modern architecture. And one of the great things about this kind of Jamstack approach is it really kind of empowers front end developers to build out full experiences very independently. So by using things like serverless functions that allow a front end developer to use their kind of existing JavaScript skills to start writing maybe something that's close to like a back end functionality, we see teams kind of able to do like have a lot more autonomy and able to kind of tackle more complex apps than maybe they could in the past as a kind of small, very focused team. And a huge thing for a lot of our customers is this makes it much easier for them to hire people that are able to work on the site, right? So they can pull from this large pool of JavaScript, React, Vue developers, and their skills are kind of applicable to all sorts of different projects that they might be doing within the Jamstack ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. And so putting all of this together, like what is it that you have to consider when you actually build a Jamstack or a decoupled application, right? It could be a little different from what you're used to because since we're decoupling the front end from the back end, everything from your code to your content and your building and hosting are all separate, right? So you need, first of all, maybe your code lives in a Git provider. Your content is living in a headless CMS. So it's only providing the backend to store that content, but not also generating the view that goes with it, like a traditional WordPress app, for instance. And you need what's called a static site generator that will actually pre-build the site into static assets. Um, and then finally, also a platform or infrastructure that will actually go ahead and build this for you, right? Like, where are you going to build it? Where are you going to deploy it? So the pieces of the stack are a little different from what you might be used to, but these are the most common ingredients of the Jamstack if you think of it. But now we'll also go into like, now if you dive into each of these separately, like what should you be choosing, right? And so quoting the famous Cassidy Williams, I'd say it depends on your project. It depends on what you're building. It depends on your team skills. It depends on what you're going for. Is it performance or a content workflow? So choosing a CMS or choosing a static site generator is very personal. And usually with CMSs, like if we start with that, most teams have a content system in place. So whether you're using WordPress or Drupal, they all have headless versions of their application. So I could use APIs that will pull content from a WordPress or a Drupal, or I could go ahead and use, one of these very specific headless CMSs like Contentful or Strapi or Prismic to actually build my application. And there's the Git based flavors, there's the API based flavors. So you can really get creative with what works out for you all. But we've seen both on Netlify, right? Like for instance, Clepier, they used Sitecore previously, but they wanted the benefits of speed and a snappy experience on the website. So they continued using Sitecore in a headless fashion, but then just built and deployed them as static sites on Netlify. Whereas if you look at Victoria Beckham Beauty, they started fresh, right? Like they chose Contentful as their headless CMS. They have Shopify as their e-commerce backend, and they build those sites on Netlify. So it really depends on what your team is used to. Um, but I think it's the same story with static site generators. Like Chris, do you want to dive into how teams are choosing that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so much innovation going on in this space, and loads of really exciting new frameworks coming out that allow teams all kinds of really interesting options around how they build their sites, like using a combination of maybe static generation and kind of more dynamic server side rendering, and kind of mixing all those things together. Um, so there's lots of really great choices. I think one of the key things to consider is kind of what skills do your team already have. So if your team very familiar with React, then things like Next.js or Gatsby are great choices to kind of use that React experience. Nux is a great choice if you're mainly focused on something like Vue. And there's some really exciting kind of early players like Astro that allow people to use kind of a combination of all those things, but use a kind of similar model to some of those larger frameworks, and do that in a way that ships maybe less JavaScript. That can be really great for sites where performance is really important, or you have a lot of users that are kind of using maybe lower powered devices that are going to struggle with a very heavy kind of JavaScript site. So loads of really good choices here. And one of the cool things about a platform like Netlify is you don't necessarily just need to choose one and use that for everything, right? As Bhavana said, we see lots of teams kind of split their app up into all these different projects, and that's something that we do at Netlify ourselves. So we have our kind of main app where you manage and deploy your sites, which is written in React because it's very dynamic and just mainly pulling in user generated data. But then things like our marketing site are actually built with a framework called Eleventy, using Vue in certain places to kind of inject extra reactivity, because we've got different goals there. We're kind of interested in SEO and having pre-generated content that's able to be served fast to users. So it's really nice that you're able to choose exactly like what the right tool for a particular job is, and kind of mix those together across your whole web platform.
Yeah, for sure. I think some of this is driven by what's best for the project, but some of it was also more playful. So if you look at explorers.netlify.com, the team wanted to understand what it would be to use Cloudinary as your DAM and use Sanity as your CMS and use Next.js and see how much of a site should I pre-build and how much should I use SSR for. So I think the cool thing is you're not beholden to one tool. You can pick and choose what you want to build, and that gives flexibility as you gradually migrate more and more of your web properties over to the Jamstack on Netlify.
Yeah, and this kind of approach kind of reduces the risk of doing those sort of experiments, because you can do it in a very isolated way on a small number of pages or a small site. You don't have to kind of bring it into a large monolithic code base and kind of mess up all the stuff you already have. So it's really a great thing that allows team to kind of do these quick experiments that see if they should use a different framework.
100%. Yeah. Um, so I guess then it boils down to you have your CMS, you have your static site generator, you know what you're going to build, but where are you going to build this and where are you going to host it, right? And so some key things that that teams look for when evaluating a platform is the once moving some site like this takes a lot of effort, right? And choosing your building and your hosting infrastructure becomes very, very crucial. So you want to choose one that provides a great experience for your developers to work on and provides the tools all the way from local development all the way to production. You want one tool that's a platform that's going to meet your business needs. So be it being able to scale up for different traffic needs, or being able to provide that kind of production uptime, or just providing enterprise grade infrastructure that's globally distributed is also a consideration. And then finally, yeah, like being able to have a lot of integrations, being able to help build the kind of applications you are trying to build with all of those rich interactions and experiences using different headless CMSs and APIs is also critical. And we've seen the scary diagram pretty often. Chris, if you want to tell us what it would be to
Yeah.
build it themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is something we see some teams have kind of tried to go down this journey by themselves. They've started to build out all the pieces needed to host an application in this kind of more modern way themselves. And it's not easy, right? There's a lot of pieces you need in terms of like setting up the right build pipelines and setting up the right kind of CDN infrastructure that's going to serve these pieces around the world, and integrating things like serverless functions. There's kind of a lot of different pieces, and the last thing you want is like for a DevOps team to, you're trying to get them to spend less time maintaining your web infrastructure. You can end up getting them spending all their time maintaining this kind of CI/CD pipelines, and that's really not the goal of this sort of migration. So that's where a platform like Netlify really helps. Like, we provide a really opinionated workflow that brings all of those things together. We manage all of those things for you, and we really try and get teams on the happy path of committing code in Git, and that gets out to production. So they're able to really get the most of this sort of workflow. And there's a load of other things that are kind of baked in as well. So kind of a lot of integrations into this large ecosystem of kind of Jamstack technologies. One of the big ways we do that is through build plugins that allow you to kind of hook into different parts of your build and integrate tools like Algolia that might provide search, or logging tools like Sentry. And really although we kind of give you this happy path and easy to get started workflow, we give you a lot of hooks where you can kind of um, really kind of customize that build process if you need it, and really do all of the things you'd expect in terms of testing, continuous deployment, having multiple environments, working with monorepos. So
Yeah.
it's really simple to get started, but you can take it to very complex places if you need.
Yeah, and it's also all about giving the front end team um, the flexibility and the freedom to build and deploy and manage their own workflows. So you don't have to involve your DevOps team, because Netlify will take care of scaling your site up to production, managing traffic spikes, or being able to serve traffic from Asia as well, right? Like, so we've built out all the infrastructure that's needed in terms for fast builds, for fast deploys, for instant cache and validation, just so you can manage these apps in production. So it's a combination of everything that makes it very easy for teams to adopt the Jamstack and go to production. And I mean, like, I think knowing all of this is one thing, but also kind of providing the guidance and the best practices as you're actually migrating to the Jamstack on Netlify is another thing, right? And so what we've seen work is not, you don't have to migrate your entire site on one day and do like a big bang migration based on your timelines for go live. You can actually gradually migrate. So page by page, even section by section within a page, like how Twilio did with their console, is a totally valid approach. And an overwhelmingly huge percentage of enterprise customers we've worked with do that, right? Like they additively add the Jamstack to their infrastructure just because it's very low risk. And so, how this is made possible is using this key feature of the Netlify Edge called Netlify Redirects and Proxy. So, it's basically configuration that you can add at the edge, which will tell Netlify to either serve traffic or to proxy it. And so, content that's built on Netlify will be served by us, and any other parts will be proxied from your existing site or your existing stack, right? So, like for instance, Crossroads is like one of the fastest growing churches in the US. That's what they did. They had a new project, Crossroad Media, and they wanted to go with the Jamstack approach for that. And what they did is, without impacting the rest of their infrastructure, the rest of their sites, they slowly added parts of their site over to the Jamstack. And it's not just them; it's just a general pattern we employ with most folks. And so Chris is going to walk us through what that would look like in phases.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the Crossroads team were kind of evaluating where they were at the beginning of this project, they had a very kind of complex, like really tightly coupled system that had the CMS and the front end all entwined. And it made it really difficult for the team to add new features. And as they were thinking about kind of, how do we how do we start building out this new project? When they were thinking about doing that on the existing platform, it just seemed like it was going to be really, really challenging to do that with, and very slow to work with the existing system. So the kind of ample team that was working with Crossroads were a big proponent of this Jamstack approach, and they suggested this kind of incremental migration strategy we talked about. So kind of starting off, they had this kind of Kubernetes cluster that was running their kind of existing monolithic CMS and a couple of other microservices. And this was like responsible for routing all of the traffic within their application. And to kind of start moving with this next project, they moved their DNS records to Netlify and then used the kind of proxy and redirects rules that are available through a really simple API on Netlify to start kind of serving particular pages from Netlify, but then routing through any requests that kind of didn't match things that exist on Netlify to the legacy infrastructure. And over time, they kind of moved bigger and bigger chunks, kept keeping some things in the legacy architecture until eventually they were able to kind of retire all of those legacy services and serve everything from kind of modern decoupled sites and using headless CMS to fetch the content. And so this was just a huge huge improvement in terms of both user experience and development experience for this team. As we've talked about in a lot of these case studies before, we see the time to first byte for the site drop by a huge amount by moving to this architecture. We see the developers able to ship things much more quickly, and all of that just has a huge impact on the features the team is able to ship and get to the users.
Yeah. And one crucial thing that happens in any migration is like the day you want to go live, right? Like you have to change the DNS records. And so, be it whether you're using Fastly or Akamai, we have these well tested playbooks to migrate your site hosting over to Netlify. And you can bring either custom cert or you can use a Netlify generated cert. And we'll provide the DNS records to make sure that it's a zero to minimal downtime migration. So it's the last part, but also a crucial part of your migration. And just want to give you the confidence that we've seen and done this several times. So our support team's pretty amazing at this itself. So I know we have a lot of questions. So I just want to bring this together with yet another amazing case study that we did with Medallia, wherein they were moving from a WordPress environment. It was so difficult to make these changes and to build really rich experiences. And so what they did is they revisited the tech stack. They went with Vue. You use Prismic as their CMS. They built on Netlify, and they're able to go from building I think once pushing changes once a week to building even 30 to 40 times a day, right? Like, so they're able to push changes much faster, get stuff out to their customers, uh, in a much more efficient fashion. And they're able to focus on building those experiences rather than building and maintaining the infrastructure. So again, this case study is available. We'll share that with you. But here we are at the end of it, and I see that we have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
So
some great questions.
Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, well, it looks like kind of one of the top questions is from Arki. They say we have, here we go, it should be up on screen, but we have 10K pages on legacy WordPress, and they kind of want to think about what's the strategy they should use to migrate from that to a decoupled architecture on top of Netlify. So I think this is something we've seen a lot. Like, how would you go about advising someone on this, Bhavna?
Yeah, I mean, typically, like, okay, it's a 10K site. What I start with understanding is how long would this potentially take to build statically, right? And so that again depends on your tools, because if you use a static site generator like Hugo, it's not going to take that long. But maybe if you use a Gatsby, it could take a little longer, right? So I think having that benchmark and knowing, does 10K pages take 5 minutes or does it take 40 minutes, is a good starting point, because then we can say, are you okay with the 10 minutes or are you not okay? And then start to figure out, like, if you're not okay with it taking 40 minutes, how can we split this into smaller chunks? Is there a marketing aspect? Is there a blog? Is there docs all within one site, which you can now split as multiple smaller sites? Because again, with the Netlify proxy, you could give your end users still the same experience. They feel like they're on example.com, but internally it's like 5 different Netlify sites that's powering that one experience. So that micro front-end architecture has worked really well.
Yeah.
um, but also, like with Next.js, Chris, like there's options where you can only pre-build a section of your site, right? Like, so do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, that can be a technique that can be really useful for if you have something like a blog or a marketing site that tends to have kind of like there's a distribution of popularity in the pages, right? You might have a core set of, I don't know, 20% of the pages that get almost all of your traffic, and then loads of this kind of long tail of stuff that you still want it to be available, but it's not really getting requested very much. And we see these kind of incremental static generation techniques, which you also might see called kind of deferred static generation or distributed persistent rendering, where you're able to say, hey, these are the critical pages. I want these to be part of the build, and that'll allow you to build those core pages fast and they're ready, available on the CDN to serve. But the
Mm-hmm.
rest of the pages can be handled by these kind of on-demand rendering techniques that make them available, but and get the benefits of caching, but without having to bundle that all into the build. So that's a really interesting and powerful technique that we're seeing lots of frameworks like Gatsby, Next, kind of adopt and build as a core thing in the framework.
100%.
Um, the kind of another good question from Peter is there any limitation on the Jamstack that can be only solved during using a monolithic architecture? I think that's a really good question. I think what we just talked about actually kind of covers one of the big things that used to be a challenge with this architecture was how do I build really large dynamic sites? So I think some of these options around kind of doing deferred static generation let you scale up to much larger sites. And we see a lot of frameworks using things like server-side rendering through Lambda functions, which maybe kind of traditionally weren't considered like a Jamstack approach, but they are a tool that you can use if you kind of need that dynamic escape hatch for certain sites. So you can kind of pick and choose, right? You can use the very pure Jamstack approach for certain pages where that's appropriate, and you can bring in these other new techniques like server-side rendering where they're appropriate.
Yeah.
And I think that means we're seeing people kind of build really almost anything, right, with the Jamstack nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. I think from like it started with a pretty limited view of just like, oh, I can only build static experiences. But like if you look at the Peloton app, it's dynamic, it has videos, it has leaderboards, it has high fives, and all of that is Jamstack. So using APIs cleverly, they're injecting it into the app at different points. So all that's possible too. I think you summed it up pretty well. Um, so the next one from Jacob is about finding talent that is aware and uses Jamstack best practices, and would love to know more about how others are finding resources, right? So the one thing I love about Netlify and the Jamstack is that the ecosystem is huge, and we have like literally any topic you Google, like, right? How do I use forms with Jamstack, or how do I create a web app with a login and using Netlify? You will find an article, right? Like people are constantly posting about it. There's so much development in the open source and the closed source community to have new that fits into this Jamstack model. And the fact that you're basically building React applications or Vue.js applications, which are frameworks based on JavaScript, also just makes it easier to find these developers, like who can build, who can pick up these technologies pretty quickly. So I just want to say there's just like so many forums and communities and blog posts that explore this. But Chris, do you have anything that stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things we see with a lot of our customers is they use the fact that they've moved to this sort of approach as a recruiting tool, right? So they really shout loud about the fact that they're using these modern tools, which you know, lots of developers want to take advantage of these kind of latest tools, and also just the kind of these sort of smooth deployment workflows that you get with this sort of approach, where they don't have to spend as much time worrying about infrastructure and kind of working on scaling up servers or applying patches. Like, it allows the engineers to really focus on building great websites, which is what, a lot of engineers are really excited about, that part of the job. And so we've definitely seen like a lot of our customers have found it much easier to hire people once they've moved to this approach, and they shout about it, and then they write blog posts about how they're building things. There's a load of people who want to kind of get involved in that and learn about these new approaches and kind of get all the benefits of working with this modern technology.
Yeah. There's one around, is a MERN application basically the same? I would say the MERN application is what we call the legacy or the monolith, right? Where there's an application that you're building, it's running on a server, and every time a request is made to it is when the page is being built and then returned back. So that's different. With the Jamstack, it's essentially a new way of building where you're pre-building the site. You're not having an active server as part of every request. So that's the key difference. It's not the same.
Yeah. And the key difference there is there's no database that you have to scale. I mean, you may be using like some serverless databases as part of the stack. But yeah, every request to the front end doesn't need to go through a Node.js server, doesn't need to talk to a database. And that's just much easier to scale to these larger sites.
Yeah. And there's a lot around like finding developers and hiring them and where to learn about the Jamstack. Again, like the Jamstack itself is an architecture, and what folks would learn is um, like, these frameworks like React or Vue.js, or how do I use GraphQL and how do I connect to different backends, right? Like those are the different skill sets that your developers need to know, versus knowing something so specific like C# or PHP for running a WordPress app or running something else. So as long as I would say they're familiar with JavaScript and HTML and CSS, like that's a great starting point for them to build any Jamstack application.
Yeah. I mean, I started off working kind of exclusively with Vue in previous jobs, and have picked up React. And most developers will find they're able to kind of move between those things relatively easy. They kind of share a lot of the same fundamentals. It actually kind of relates to this question that's on screen, right? How do you stay current? How do you keep up with all these different things? It is difficult. It's a big space. I think there's great kind of conferences in this space, like the Jamstack conference and other kind of specific conferences for frameworks. That's always a great place to learn about what are some of the latest things that are happening in the space. How are people actually using those things in real use cases? I think Bhavana and I are really fortunate that we talk to a lot of teams that are doing this, and so we kind of get to see firsthand from the people we're working with, like what are some of these new approaches. But there's tons of stuff that's written in blogs and people posting on Twitter that are kind of sharing all of the new best practices and real experiences. I think that's always a good place to start. Like when people have done this stuff for real, what did they do and how did it work?
Yeah. I just want to shift gears a little. There's some around pricing. Like, does Netlify have pricing plans that are targeted for non-US folks? I would say like the pricing's on our pricing page. There's a generous free tier, and then based on the functionality that you want, there are different tiers of pricing. So you can get in touch with the sales team. We're happy to understand what your requirements are and like provide the right kind of pricing for you all. There's so many. Like, do we keep going? I know we're also at time. Just want to make sure. So looks like we have Mate asking, we have 100 plus different independently deployed sites with different tech stacks that we're trying. What would you suggest in this scenario? Okay. Um, I guess my
I-
first question is, are they all Jamstack already? Are they the decoupled apps, or are they a mix of monolith and decoupled?
Sounds like there might be monolithic things, but lots of independent ones maybe. I think similar kind of approach can work, right? Where you, like in this case, maybe it's easier, right? You can look at those individually, start with one, see how that works, and then hopefully you find a kind of template that you can apply across these different sites.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And if they're managed by different teams, like they could all work independently, working
mhm.
with the tools that they care about. And yeah, I think you can see what the ROI is on one of the apps and then see whether it makes sense to templatize that and move forward. Uh,
All right, I'm going to join you both just because we're getting up at the top of the hour. These are so many great questions from everybody. Thank you so much for asking them. And we're actually going to try and grab some of these questions and answer them in the follow-up email because there's so many great questions here. So excuse me. So I'll work with Bhavana and Chris to get some more answers to all these really, really great questions. Thank you so much, Bhavana and Chris, for sharing that with us. What a great overview. I wanted to share that in addition to the on-demand version of this webinar that we'll send out, we've got a couple of resources coming, including an ebook on this topic. And so that ebook is going to answer a lot of the same questions that Bhavana and Chris took you through today, some of the step-by-step approach to migration onto the modern web, including the steps that Bhavana and Chris outlined: auditing, planning the stack, migrating, retiring the monolith, and really will be a step-by-step guide to all the questions and checklists for you. So look out for that. We're going to include a link in the follow-up email. And please join us for our next webinar in the series. We're going to be talking commerce at the holiday season and talking about how the Jamstack ecosystem really delivers for large-scale commerce with our partners Uniform, talking about a great story that they've been working on with Hilding Anders in Europe, who are the largest manufacturer of mattresses and bedding. So join us, please, on November 18th to hear more about e-commerce specifically and the ecosystem in that space. Thank you once again to our wonderful hosts today, Bhavana and Chris. That was such great information. And thank you all around the world. I've been seeing some amazing places and highs from around the world. So thank you for joining us and being part of the community. We hope to see you again soon.